Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich. We are with the Foundation for Critical Thinking, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we are based in California. And in this series, we're focused on the analysis of reasoning, going deeper. In this part of the series in the series, we're focused on questions. And in this particular session, we're going to focus on identifying prior questions and talking about why that's important, and focusing on and unpacking complex interdisciplinary questions. And if we have time, we'll go further, but we'll start there. So if I could, I'll just explain for a couple of minutes what identifying prior questions means. But first, let me say hello, Gerald.
Hi, Linda. Good to be with you again. To be able to talk about questions. Yes, very good.
We do tend to launch right in. So when we're focusing on questions, again, there are many ways in which we can use questions to enter problems and issues. So we've been exploring those in this series. And one way is by taking a question that is in itself complex, and therefore it contains questions that you would have to answer before you could answer that, let us say, final question. And let's say remind us that it is through questions that we have guides for our thinking. So so the better we are at unpacking the questions, and in this case, coming up with the questions we would need to ask before we could answer the real question we want to ask. So we need some experience in this. And so let's start with the question, what is history? And we actually have this example in the Art of Asking Essential Questions guide. So what is history? Let's say we're asking that question. Well, let's say we're at a party, if you can imagine, and somebody starts talking about history, and somebody says, well, what is history? So to answer that, here are some questions we'd need to answer first. To what extent do all historians share the same goal? So when we ask what is history, we're asking about historians as well, because historians write history. Is it possible to include all relevant facts of the past in a history book? Now notice these are pretty simple. And how many of that is to answer in comparison to the main question, which is complex. How many of the events during a given time period are left out in the history of that time period? Is more left out than is included? How does a historian know what to emphasize? Or you could say, how does a historian decide what to emphasize? Can historical value judgments be objective? What variables might influence a historian's viewpoint? Is it possible to simply list facts in a history book, or does all history writing involve interpretations as well as facts? How can we begin to evaluate a historical interpretation? So if within every historical book we have historical interpretations, not just facts, then how do we evaluate that interpretation, those interpretations? And how do we begin to evaluate a historical point of view? Now note that the last couple of questions are more complex than the first one. So when we think about prior questions, we have to just say, okay, it's a complex question that we're focusing on. And then we would ask, what are all of the questions that we would have to answer before we could answer that? And some of those questions will be, let's say, simple. There'll be procedural questions. There will be what we call category 1 questions, questions of fact or judgment. And many of these are, but some of them will also require reasoned judgment. So some of them will be complex category, what we call category 3 questions. So just say complex questions in which we have to reason within more than one point of view. So this is an example. This is a starting place for our thinking. So I thought we could then, Gerald, first of all, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I wouldn't say we have to explicate all the concepts, that all the prior questions before we can address the main question we're interested in, but we want to explore at least the most important ones, and maybe explore them not definitively, but just through the act of the questions for example, you just read about history, just for the example of contemplating those, thinking about those for a while, the difference between facts and interpretation of the facts, what's left out, what's included, how does a historian decide what, just by thinking about those for a while, it starts to both clarify our view of history and also complexify our view of what history is. And I think both of those are advantageous, because very often people's pronouncements about history, I'm not speaking of historians now, but people's ordinary pronouncements of history are very simple, one-off kinds of responses. And this points to a great deal of the complexity about what we know about the past. So yeah, so I'm agreeing with you completely, and it just seems to me to be, it seems to me to be necessary much of the time for us to explore prior questions if we really want to have a good sound answer, maybe not a definitive one again, but a good sound answer to a main question we want to be asking. So an example, for me, an example might be a question instructors, teachers often ask, and what should I do to teach my class better? Just as a very natural way, I could wonder, well, what exactly is teaching? What do I mean by teaching?
Exactly.
And then I would say, well, it's correlated with learning. So what's my concept of learning and how teaching and learning fit together? And once I start doing that, I, at least off the top of my head right now, think that if there's teaching, but there's an act like teaching, but there isn't any learning going on, then I'm not at all sure it really counts as teaching. So if I lecture the whole time and my students are not understanding what it is I'm saying, I can call that teaching if I want, but if there's no learning taking place, then I'm not sure it is teaching. I'm not saying it in a blaming way, though. I'm not saying that, because I've had students who have said, you know, it's your job to teach me. It's not my job to work to think my way through these things. And so I'm not embracing that view at all. But in general, if the people can understand the language and if it's at the appropriate level and all, then I want to judge the extent to which I'm teaching well, or the extent to which I should try different things in my teaching, kind of to be correlated with my conception of what it is to learn something. So that seems to me to be a straightforward example of a prior question that I need to ask.
Yes, well, you raise a number of interesting points there. The first move that you made was to say, we don't necessarily need all of these prior questions.
Right.
And because let me just say this in my own words, so that, because if we take half of these seriously, then we maybe also deal with the other half in the way that these particular ones are laid out. Some of them, these are somewhat saying the same thing in different ways. But one of the things that's so fascinating about questions is that we can begin to articulate the question, and we can say, okay, we basically know what the questions are, but we don't necessarily explicitly state the questions that are implied in the original question. Or let's say we're dealing with a cluster of questions, and we're not dealing with the cluster very well because we're not able to articulate the questions very well because we don't have any theory of questions. So what I'm saying is we want a very rich, developed theory of questions but then know that sometimes we've done enough thinking. It's in a similar way. In the similar way, we can approach the elements of reasoning.
Right.
So if we take purpose and question and interpretation seriously, well, maybe that's all we need right now, because we've clarified the purpose, which was really our problem, and then everything fell into place. You see, so
Right. Yeah.
it's like what we're doing is we're building our toolbox. And you're saying, yeah, and we don't necessarily need all those tools every time.
Right.
But what we do have to do is we have to make sure that we're adequately addressing the issue.
Right. And with respect to history, I'm thinking there's something, there's what seems to me initially to be something like a second step in it, because all major historians that I know of, all reputable historians, confront the question, how do I select what to present, and what filters am I using to decide what to present and in what light and from what point of view? So I think they think there's a standard that's in the preface of almost any well done history book that says something like that. But then there's another step, and my impression is that many historians don't consider it. So they're saying, here's the filter I use, or here's the point of view I use to decide what to include and what not. But then they don't seem to ask, what's another point of view I could use? Or how would this look from a very different vantage point, a different historical vantage point, meaning a historian's vantage point. So that, yeah, so Marxist historians, there's any number of them who are just really excellent, approach things from a more or less Marxist kind of point of view, and they own that. They say it straightforwardly, so that you, as a way of guiding the reader to what they're planning to do, what their purpose is. But then they don't often ask, well, what would this look like from a different non-Marxist point of view, right? So.
Yeah. So this illuminates that the fact that though there are highly skilled historians and psychologists and professionals and thinkers in every field, it doesn't follow that they're using the toolbox of critical thinking that we're advocating.
Right.
And one thing we're arguing is that if we all use the tools more often, our thinking will be at a much higher level.
Right.
And these are examples of how we can enter a question.
Right.
And you see, if you take the and by the way, your example of the Marxist theoreticians, one of the things that people do is they'll say, I'm thinking as well as I can within this point of view. They're not necessarily saying that explicitly, but and they are, as you say, often doing that. But then what is being left out of that argument?
Right.
And as you say, what point of view is not being considered?
Yeah.
And so, like, take what is history? This is a good question for us in the United States, because we have brushed a lot of our history under the rug, and it keeps trying to come out, and we keep trying to brush it back under. So when I was a child, there was the textbooks didn't even pretend to even be trying to be even-handed with things like how we treated Black, just the African-American in our history. And that was just not, there was no apology, just that's it. We didn't hear about it. We didn't read, of course there were little snippets.
Right.
But now people are saying that's not good enough.
Right. I'm struck by the difference between the way elementary school elementary school students in New York versus elementary school students in Louisiana. The striking difference there is in their treatment of slavery. I mean, in the history books for elementary school or high school students in Louisiana, there's a very small section on slavery. Right? And in New
It's like
York,
a paragraph. It might be.
yeah. So they could say, well, we've included it, but in New York, it's gone into quite extensively, maybe not extensively as it occurred, but another good example, one that often comes to my mind, is about even when I was a graduate student, I read a lot of history and I read a lot of American history. So I read about the American Revolution, and I thought I knew about it, and the historians spoke as if they knew about it. And it took a while before it came out that there are no women in American history. There were no women. They're not mentioned at all. And I actually then went back and read history books about the American Revolution. I mean, there are a few, Betsy Ross and Dolly Madison, but they're just mentioned in passing. I went back and read some women historians from before 1960, say, and they also don't seem to notice that the women are missing. That is, this mainstream way of doing history just leaves out a significant 50% of the population. And another example is that it's not until the 1950s that historians began to notice people other than government leaders, right? Like farmers and ordinary people as they go about their business. That was a big discovery of that they'd been missing all of this time. So it's amazing to me often how we can overlook such things. And there's a sense in which that's a strong part of the prior questions. Who should our history, be describing?
Right. I mean, what is history? If we look at it, can seem sort of, as I said, it can be taken superficially. And what we're trying to show is how complex it really is with the questions that we ask.
Right.
And by the way, your example that you gave about teaching is related to another question that we could ask, which is, let's just say, what is education? So if that's our main question, what is education? Then what questions would we have to ask to answer that? So now we're for the audience, so you know this is not rehearsed, as you can tell.
Right.
And so we're going to just explore this and see how we do with this. So what is education? So I can think of a few. Would you like to?
Well, I would think we'd have to be clear about what the main purpose of education, where the main purposes, main goals of education are, as at least one of the moves in there.
Okay, so what is the purpose of education, or what are the purposes of education?
I was afraid you were going to ask that, Linda. I was asking the question.
Pardon?
I said I was afraid you were going to ask me that one.
No, I'm just clarifying. I'm clarifying your questions.
Yeah.
You know, all we're doing is asking the questions. We're not obliged to answer them just at the moment. So then another question would be, what is the opposite of education? Or what is not education? Or what is not education, but is often confused as education?
Right. Yeah, that's a very nice question. I'd never thought of that one before. What's not education? Yeah. To revert to something else, we often talk about SEEI, state, elaborate, give an example and an illustration. And I'll often add to that, not just give an example, give a contrasting example, something that's not in the category you're trying to define, but is often thought of as being in the category you're trying to define. That is, what's a contrasting example of teaching, or in this case, of education. And there are several different varieties as I'm thinking about it, but very nice. Yes.
So what is the question that you're thinking of? That would be a prior question here.
The question is, I was really just elucidating what you were saying. That is,
Oh, I
what's a
see.
contrasting example of
Yes,
education?
exactly.
Something-
Okay, that's okay. So
Yeah.
so then we could say, to bring in some contrasting concepts,
Mhm.
we could say, what is the difference between, or what are the differences, or let's just say, what is the difference between education and training?
Right,
And these are some that we often use in our work with
Right.
educators. What is the difference between education and socialization?
right,
What is the
Right.
difference between education and indoctrination?
right, right,
Because
right.
those are not education, but they appear as they're facsimiles,
Mhm.
they're fake, but they appear real.
Right. Yeah, especially with indoctrination, I would say
Right.
training sometimes can be
Mhm.
part of education. What
And
we sometimes,
yeah, that you're right. And then socialization is in there, but
right,
what is not understood is that in schooling, indoctrination historically has been the rule,
yeah,
not the exception,
right,
right? So we mainly want people to still believe the beliefs that
right,
we believe. So
right,
that's just, we want students to do as we do, through sort of through osmosis or something like that, and
right,
don't question. And
right,
this is why critical thinking has um, such a difficult time in the lower grades.
Mhm.
And because
Yeah,
do parents really want their children to think critically? Of course, many do, but many don't.
right,
And so in other words, if we're really asking a child to think critically about something, what are the implications of our opening the child's mind in a setting which doesn't allow for it?
right. And sometimes people will oppose the critical thinking by kind of unconsciously but biasedly choosing examples like should you be questioning your family's values? And many parents are against teaching children to question their family's values. And I think that when they say that, they're thinking about their own values and that they don't want their children to be questioning their own values. But they do want children to be questioning the values of their abusive parents or their alcoholic parents or their parents who want to engage in violence. So if I only think about my values and I don't want my child to be questioning my values, I'm often not considering the range of values there is in families and how I do want children to think about those and to question those. So there's a selective quality of choosing the examples that lead my thinking.
Well, it's true that to the degree that we cultivate critical thinking anywhere in human societies, it tends to be according to some purpose and
Right.
within some framework, within some box.
Right.
So do companies really want their employees to be thinking critically in a full sense?
Right.
And so that's why a question like what is education, like what is history, is a very important question.
Mhm.
And so let's just say, if you are a teacher and you have never asked the question, what is education?
Right.
Then you should be doing that.
You should be.
Because
Yes.
you are by implication saying, I am educated. I am an educator.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say that, you should have great justification behind that.
Right.
You should be able to state, elaborate, exemplify all the things that you do to advance that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So these are some questions we can ask when we're focusing on a question like what is education?
Right.
You could say, is it possible to educate people in today's world,
Mhm.
something like that.
Mhm.
Is it possible? Is it possible to, now that may not be a prior question, but if, let's just say what, maybe what is education is our first question. And the question I'm asking is it possible for me to educate myself? Can I be self-educated?
Yeah, not necessarily completely though, right?
Well, I'm just kind of keeping it open.
Right.
I don't know that, I mean, is, if you say, when I was thinking about self-education, you see, I don't know, self-education is not, it's not clear what that necessarily means in a context, because everyone has been taught by others,
Yeah.
right? So even if you haven't, it means you haven't been to school to a certain degree,
Mhm.
right? But if you really press on that self-education,
Yeah.
pretty soon you get to people that taught you. So therefore, the term self-education, we have to be clear about what we mean there.
Would it mean that you don't read any books, for
No,
instance?
I think, well, that would be, so
Mhm.
we take self-education. Now we're asking, what does it mean to be self-educated? So we're
Mhm.
taking a prior question, then we're coming up with prior questions
Mhm.
to that question.
Mhm.
So is it possible to become self-educated
Mhm.
without reading any books? And we're not necessarily answering these questions,
Right.
but I'm tempted to answer
Mhm.
that one
Mhm. Mhm.
because I don't see how you really could. Um,
No.
right? I don't see how you could be you can be self-trained, and many people are. Many people have, they haven't been to that many years of school, but they have a lot of skills
Mhm.
within a terrain.
Mhm.
But that is not the same as being an educated person.
Right. Right. And yeah, I mean, I said books, but clearly doesn't need to be books, because there are societies where people did not have literate skills, and there were still many people who were, there were people there who were critical thinkers and who might be called self-taught. I mean, Socrates comes to mind. He's not exactly self-taught. He's read these other
Right.
philosophers, but even in societies where there aren't any books, there are critical thinkers, and I think, but they're not going to be self-taught. They're going to learn things from elders, from people they interact with, from things that they hear. So it's not always just going to be books, of course. I just happen to say books.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, the important thing is the exposure to the ideas.
yeah, right, right.
And we tend to get the ideas through books
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
because the ideas of a great thinker are captured within the book.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And if that comes down to us another way,
mm-hmm,
then it's going to be getting diluted, most
mm-hmm,
likely. And so first source is always important. And
mm-hmm.
one thing that's really missing in our schooling process is the importance of going to those early sources and those first voices.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say that our topic is, the general topic we began with is the topic of prior questions. In general, I've been going through several examples of them, but it just occurred to me as we were going through this that we have ready examples of prior questions that are always relevant. and that is questions having to do with the elements of reasoning and the standards of critical thinking. So if I'm wondering what is education, a good prior question for me to be asking is, well, what are my assumptions about education? Or what's the purpose of education? Or what are the implications and consequences of being educated or not? And to go to the standards, am I being clear about what education is? How specific am I being about what it is to be educated? But the great thing about the elements and the standards is that they apply everywhere. And so those, I think, are good prior questions always to be asking.
That's the cheater move, right? I mean, that if we know, if we've internalized this other theory, this primary theory, then we can say, well, what is the purpose of history? What questions do historians ask?
Right.
How do they use the information? What kinds of information do they use? So you're right. That's exactly right. And some of those were built into some of the questions that I asked.
Right.
But then we also need to be able to contextualize, right, to the specific.
As we always do, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So I hope that what we've been able to do is to point out the importance of taking a question and which is complex and opening it up by asking questions that once you answered those, you would then be in a good position to ask your original question or answer it rather. And so some of the questions that you gave, you just gave a number of, you added to the list. So one of the questions that came from that is, for me, what is a reasonable conception of education? And what is the relationship between education and critical thinking? Do you have to be a critical thinker to be educated?
Yeah.
You have to be educated to be a critical thinker.
I'm not, with the first one, that seems to me clearly yes, that to use the word reasonable, to a reasonable extent, you need to be a critical thinker in order to be educated. That is, you have to question what you read, you have to question what comes from sources, you have to think about, so what are the consequences of this? What are the consequences for this that I'm not seeing? What points of view should I consider? If you're not doing any of that, I'm not saying you have to do all of that to be educated, but if you're not doing any of that, then it's hard for me to see how you're being educated. You're being kind of programmed in a way if you're not asking any of those. That is, the information is going into you, or the principles are going into you, but you're not seeing how they work out. You're not reflecting on them at all.
So I'm trying to figure out how someone else might come to this reality without having, or this question without having the concept of critical thinking. So one prior question would be something like this: what are the skills of an educated person? What are the dispositions of an educated person? Because if you see the skills, some of them you were just focusing on, the skills of critical thinking. If you understand the skills of an educated person, then you will get it, you'll reach critical thinking.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I was actually writing down.
I mean, you won't read, when I said you'll reach it, you'll touch it. You won't necessarily, you won't have the whole toolbox, but you'll begin to see the connections between critical thinking and the skills of an educated person.
Right. And I think that educators, I'm kind of thinking of K through 12, but I think it applies to college and university as well. I think that one of the main ways that aspects of critical thinking are taught, even by people before critical thinking developed as a field or as an area to explore, is to ask students, okay, so you've just read this about history or about any topic in the course, about the Constitution, about anything, and the teacher then asks, so how do you understand that? How do you understand what's written there? I mean, how would you apply that in your life? Or where do you see examples of that? So they're asking questions that provoke critical thinking. They don't necessarily step back from those questions so that the students learn to ask those questions themselves, but the students are engaging in critical thinking themselves, even without critical thinking theory
right.
to reinforce it. And when I think back of who were my good teachers, long before there was any knowledge in me of critical thinking as an area, there was the teachers who did that. And they didn't always do that directly. Sometimes they would say, okay, I want you to read this book on the other side and write a report on the other side of this issue, the other side from what I was advocating as a strident adolescent or something.
So teachers will often make these moves. That is, they're making a critical thinking move,
right?
But they're not necessarily calling it that, especially at that time,
right?
And then they're not necessarily seeing the bigger picture,
right,
of critical thinking,
right?
And by the way, this is a really interesting discussion, because if you take the question, what is education, and you say, well, let's just look it up in the dictionary. Well, you're going to find connections to what we've been talking about, but it's going to be, a paragraph. It's how can you capture something like education in a paragraph, or a few lines. So what I'm saying is we're going to still need to explore further, to come up with, let's say, here's another way of asking the question, what is an educated person? How does an educated person behave differently from a person who is not educated or undereducated?
Right, or indoctrinated, or just socialized,
right?
Other alternative words. Because uneducated often has the connotation of just someone who hasn't gone to school very much, and that's not what you mean by it.
Right.
Right.
So, in any case, this question is essential for all teachers to explore.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to just look up education in just an online dictionary.
Okay.
And because one of the things I'm reminding us that we're doing in this series is we're showing how you learn. We're showing how we learn. So we are in a discussion, something comes up, we're talking about prior questions, but suddenly I said something about the definition. If you look it up, and then I said a few things in it. So why not just look it up right now and bring this definition to the table? So let me just read. The act or process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge. Developing the powers of reasoning and judgment. And generally of preparing oneself or others intellectually for mature life.
Wow.
So you see, that's going to require a lot of thinking to unpack that. And then there are other uses. So number 2, the act or process of imparting or acquiring particular knowledge or skills as for a profession. So somebody might say, well, how much knowledge do you really have in the field of X? Number 3, a degree, level, or kind of schooling, as in a university education, or a K-12 education. The result produced, number 4, the result produced by instruction, training, or study, as in to show one's education. That's kind of an interesting one. Then 5, the science or art of teaching, or pedagogics. So let's go back to the first one, because that's the one that's the most relevant to this discussion.
I-
As I understand the concept, what is education?
Okay.
So it's again, the act or process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge, developing the powers of reasoning and judgment.
Oh,
And let's just focus on those two.
okay.
So the first one is focusing on acquiring general knowledge.
Mhm.
And of course, this has been an argument that's been made for, historically, that that's a key to education. And it cannot be denied that there's certain kinds of knowledge that we should all have. But
Right.
what can be debated is what that knowledge is. And that's what we've never really agreed upon.
Right.
But that's a big discussion. So we could say, if our question is what is education, we can say, if taking this part into account,
Mhm.
is there general knowledge that everyone needs to have to be an educated person?
Mhm.
If so, what is that general knowledge?
Mhm. Is
And
maturity in that definition, or is that?
yes, that was the third part I didn't read.
Okay. Okay.
I'll read it again too. So, because there were three parts. That was the first part, acquiring general knowledge. Second part, powers of reasoning and judgment, developing. And the third, generally of preparing oneself or others intellectually for mature life. Now, mature life, we'd have to look that up. But to just focus on these first two parts. So you could ask, are there certain readings that everyone should engage in critically and internalize that all of us should have as humans? So, for example, you could say, well, should all humans read in the Stoic philosophers? Should all humans read Socrates' Apology? And we can argue, we know that people are going to argue this back and forth. But what we can do is ask the question, should we have general knowledge? And if so, if we're going to have this, and we realize we're going to have to decide what it is. And when we make that move, we need to make sure that it's a reasonable move. In other words, that we come up with reasonable answers to that. But it's messy. You see, that's one of the purposes, again, of this series, is to show that reasoning is sometimes just it's going to be complicated. Now, the second part of this, developing the powers of reasoning and judgment, welcome critical thinking. So that's really, that gives an interest to the entirety of critical thinking, as I understand the theory, or as I conceptualize it, right? Because we can find, and if we have reasoning, we have critical reasoning. Judgment has to do with the criteria. So there you have it. So this what I want to say is that we have complex questions facing us. And right now, as humans, we're not thinking very well about those. And prior questions is one way in. So here's the question. Let me just list every single question I would have to answer that question. And sometimes I'm going to have some offshoots, and maybe I'm going to get a little bit off because I came up with a question that wasn't exactly relevant, but it's a question I thought of in this process. I'll bring this over here. Right. So we don't say, hey, that's not relevant, Linda, so kick that out. Well, maybe it's more significant though than some of these others, right? That's right.
Yeah.
So then let's, if we could, just for a few minutes, turn to asking complex interdisciplinary questions, because these two are related.
Right.
Now, what basically this theory, it basically says that when you have a complex question, obviously we know we have to consider multiple points of view, that we realize. So how do we enter that? What does that really mean for a given question? So what it means is that there are domains within every complex question that we have to reason within. So, for example, if we have a given question, we can ask, does this have a biological component? Does this have a conceptual component? Does this have a political component? Does this have an ethical dimension? What are the dimensions? And some of these dimensions are going to overlap.
Right.
So if we take, for instance, in our Asking Essential Questions guide, we have the example, what can be done about the number of people who abuse illegal drugs? Now we could take that question and we can treat it as in terms of prior questions. In other words, we can say, okay, what questions would you have to answer that?
Right.
Another way in is because we know that this is going to involve multiple domains of thought. We can first identify those domains, or we can just list the questions and figure out what the domains are after we list the questions. So, for example, we know that if we ask the question, what can be done about the number of people who abuse illegal drugs? We know that there is an economic dimension to that.
Right.
So we can ask what economic forces support drug use, and what can be done to minimize the influence of money involved in the drug culture. So this is a beginning place. And then we know there's going to be a political dimension.
Right.
What possible solutions to drug abuse are politically acceptable? Are there any potential politically realistic solutions? To what extent does the political structure exacerbate the problem? This is, again, just giving a few questions in each category to show that you have these dimensions, and now we can begin to see the complexities. Then we have a social or sociological dimension. What social structures and practices support this drug abuse? How does gang membership contribute to this problem, etc.? Then there's a psychological dimension. Right? How do factors such as stress, individual personality differences, and childhood trauma support drug abuse? What role, if any, does human irrationality play in drug abuse? And then we have a biological dimension. How do genetics play a role if they do in drug abuse? Then we have an educational dimension, because we know that we're going to have education to diminish the problem. So what can educational institutions do to reduce the incidence of drug abuse? What role are they now playing to support or diminish the problem?
Right.
And for example, you can say, is education leading to, or let's say the lack of education leading to people becoming disconnected from the community, etc. You see, so there are obviously other questions we can ask. There's going to be potentially a religious dimension. What can religious institutions do to reduce the incidence of drug abuse? What role are they playing now with regard to the problem? And then there's a cultural dimension. So we have economic, political, sociological, psychological, biological, educational, religious, cultural, and maybe more. And just a couple of examples in each one. And so you see, I think this way of approaching questions is very powerful, because, for example, so if I understand this, if I just understand the structure, then I can take a question like, what can be done about the problem of sustainability of the Earth's resources? That's a very broad question, very complex. So is there going to be an economic dimension? Is there going to be a political dimension, sociological, psychological, biological? Maybe all of these will apply, but we'd have to tweak it. So if I understand this, that there are these complexities, then I can, when I'm dealing with a complex question, I can immediately know, Linda, this is going to be hard. So you're going to have So how do we bring peace to the world?
Mhm, mhm.
How do we stop having wars?
Right,
That question has many prior questions
right,
implicit in it, and many domains that we would have to think well within.
right,
We'd have to use critical reasoning within all of these.
right,
So now what we're doing as humans is we are thinking critically within some of these,
right.
but we've got to do it within all of the dimensions that are contained in the question. Now I will pause and allow you, Gerald, to
Well,
jump in.
I'm I'm uneasy about it. I get the spirit of what you're saying, and I agree with the spirit of it, but I wouldn't want the complexity of such a question, or the number of multiple perspectives that are involved in it, to get in the way of acting on the question insofar as we have knowledge or understanding in this domain or in that domain. We have a number of things that we can do to make agriculture more sustainable. There are ways of addressing drug abuse, that illegal drug abuse and legal drug abuse. There are ways that work to a certain extent on some of those people, and so I wouldn't want. There's a way in which if I see this multiplicity of dimensions, I'm tempted to throw up my hands and say, I'm never going to think my way through all of that. What's the use? I think I'm going to go play chess. That's what I wanted to guard against. There's not a necessity of answering everything, or if quantifying in here makes any sense at all. There's not even any likelihood that I'm going to address 90% of the major questions in any kind of adequate way. So I wouldn't want the complexity to get in the way of measures that are based on partial or some dimensional knowledge that have been shown to be effective.
Okay, now we can agree and then we can disagree. We can agree with on part of this and disagree on part of it. So obviously I agree on the part where wherever we can make moves that have any effectiveness, we should make those moves. So let's say I'm a psychologist and all I can do is deal with the psychological dimension. But let's say I can do that, and it will help. And maybe it will help significantly. But on the other hand, the question at issue determines the thinking we have to do to answer the question. And these questions are not just, made up and thrown in. These are questions that are relevant to answering the first question. So take sustainability. It's a perfect example. People are doing a lot of excellent things right now in the green economy and in the green movement. But we still may lose the war, because if our thinking is not good enough, if we're not making enough of the right moves, then what does that mean for the future of the planet? And we are in big trouble right now. Let's hope that somebody who's listening to this 100 years going, I'm glad we figured all these things out since they died and they're gone, but we've now gotten a lot smarter and we figured these things out. Now, this, for example, take the political dimension. The political dimension and the economic dimension are both getting in the way of addressing sustainability to a considerable degree. And if we continue to allow the economics to be as they are, then we will not be able to beat this timeline that we're facing. You see, so the question itself determines the thinking that you have to do. You can decide whether to answer the question or not, but in the end, the question will determine what the thinking is.
And I would not say it that way. I would say that it's not that the question determines what I have to do or the further questions that I have to address. I would say the question plus what can I call it? The intractability of the world determines the questions I need to answer. That is, there's a lot. So if I say, for instance, that to address the problems of sustainability, there has to be a massive economic reform of the way the world functions.
Mhm.
I believe that something like that is true, but I also believe that the chances of having a massive economic reform of the way the world functions financially is not, if it's achievable, it's not going to be achievable in the next 100 years. So
Mhm.
there's a way which I'm not saying that absolutely, but so there's a way in which if I focus on the economic element or large scale reform, I'm cutting out a lot of the success that we can have.
No,
So
we agree on that.
yeah, I thought
That we agree on.
right. Yeah.
And I don't think that we actually disagree. I think
Right.
the question does lay out the intellectual tasks that are required of us, but we can answer that partially, and that's what you're saying. Don't just throw everything out, Linda, if you can't just have the partial. I'll take the partial.
Right.
Trust me, that's fine. But what critical thinking does is it does provide the tools for us to reach these higher levels.
Right. That, yeah. Yes.
And that's what we need to be able to see. And so then if we say, for example, right now there's a war that's just been started and it's in the Ukraine. And if we ask how should Ukraine position itself in the world to be safe? To answer that question, you have to take into account that Russia is right there, and Russia wants Ukraine, and Russia is huge, and Ukraine is tiny, and so if you have a bully that's right beside you, and you can't do anything about this, it just is the fact that this bully is there. How are you going to position yourself to be safe? And maybe you have to do things you don't want to do. Right. You have to give things up you would prefer not to give up, because this is a real world. So I think that we do agree on
I
this.
do too. Right.
So we tend to do that. We would sometimes feel like it's a bit of a disagreement, but it's really not. And that's, again, one of the beauties of this process, because we show how much is involved in working through these complexities.
Indeed, yes. Yeah, very much so. Right. Right.
And so then now we could come up with other examples, but I think we've given the main idea behind prior questions and interdisciplinary questions. And then both of these are basically dealing with complex questions and ways to unpack them.
Right.
And so if you're facing a complex problem in your life, you should know that it's got multiple domains.
Right.
So let's take what would it do? What would it take to be a good parent? So that's got multiple domains, right? So you can be very good in this. Like, you could be very good at being a little kid parent. Like, you're very good with the little tiny ones.
Right.
But as soon as they become teenagers, and you just rather not be a parent. And I'm sure that there are multiple people that can relate to that. Yeah. So because it's sort of, this part seems easy and this is more complex. So that's an example. And so to be a good parent, you have to think well within multiple domains.
Right.
And so you have to think well about the child's education. You have to think well about your own thinking. Critical thinking. You have to be a critical thinker, and you have to think well about their diet. I mean, everything about the child. You've got to be a doctor, you've got to be a nurse, you've got to be, so you got to think within all of these domains.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they want to be an athlete, then you have to think athletically along with them insofar as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And if they want to be a musician, then you've got to help them. You've got to learn something about the process of being a musician.
Mm-hmm.
And so that parenting is a good example, because you never quite, as soon as you figure one thing out, like one part of life, one time in life, once you figure that time out, like, okay, I figured out what it takes to deal with a 3-year-old, then they're 4. And then as soon as you figure out what, how to be a good 4-year-old parent, then they're 5.
Right.
And that keeps, so that's
it's a nice example. I live with my 2-year-old granddaughter, who's just turned 2, and she's turned from being a docile, smiling, accepting person to someone who is, how can I put it politely, not so docile, not so accepting, not so smiling, but I'm aware of the psychological literature that talks about the terrible twos and the changes that take place toward independence. But when my own son turned 2, I wasn't aware of that at all. And it just seemed like he's changed completely, and he's never going to go back to being accepting or smiling or docile. And of course, that wasn't true. And I didn't learn about the terrible twos until he was almost 3. But so it shows how having a perspective and getting the knowledge and understanding that comes from that perspective can change everything. It would have lessened my anxiety tremendously to think, oh, this is a part of what you have to go through to grow up. And I didn't know that.
That's interesting. That shows you how, like, if you were thinking of minimal amounts of knowledge for parenting.
Right.
We were talking about that before.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing would be to understand the terrible twos.
Right.
And then connected to that, understand the teenage years.
Right. That's right.
So
yeah.
The terrible twos, the reason why that's so important is because unless you are a very good parent, you will make a lot of mistakes in that time period.
Right.
Because you will misunderstand the child repeatedly.
Yeah.
And the child is simply trying to see how to get power. And they're going to do all kinds of things that just drive you, where you want to. And so you have to, I think that's when those of us who have been parents, that's when you really look at yourself in the mirror and you say, okay, what kind of person am I going to be? Because, some are harder than others.
Right. And and even it strikes me that even that small amount of knowledge, the terrible twos, if I can say this, it doesn't actually have to be completely accurate. That is, it can be helpful without it. I mean, if I read psychologists now who said this is greatly exaggerated and some children go through it this time, some go through it at other times, I'm pretending all of this is true, but it seems very likely to be so, that there are all these disagreements about this kind of phase that goes on. But just the perspective it gives me, independent of its complete accuracy, gave me a peace of mind, gives me a peace of mind to see this through to the other side. So,
yes, and that I was thinking when I said terrible twos, I was thinking that I think of that as a broad range.
Right.
It can go up to 5. It can go further. It's really a need for power.
Right.
Humans have that great need for power. And if we can learn to get and to use power appropriately in the childhood era, then we're a lot better off. And that takes a lot of skilled parenting, especially when you have certain very difficult children.
Right.
So
the term terrible twos resonates with me strongly, because with my son all those years ago, on his 2nd birthday is when he changed. He just said no. and so it just came as a complete shock to me. So that's not my granddaughter though.
Yes. So I hope that this has been productive and helpful for those of you who are with us.
Mhm.
And let me give a kind of homework assignment then, to take a question that you think is important, and this could be in your field. It can be, if I teach psychology, it can be, what is psychology? And then just list the questions I would have to answer before I answered that question.
Mhm.
And that actually prepares me for a Socratic dialogue
Mhm.
in class.
Mhm.
And that's one homework
Mhm.
assignment.
Mhm.
Another is to take another question and to figure out the domains embedded in the question. And
Right.
again, go to our Asking Essential Questions guide, our section on interdisciplinary questions, asking complex interdisciplinary questions
Mhm.
for assistance with that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
just practice this, because what I think, again, is by going through the practice, what we see is that when we are faced with a problem like sustainability, then we can readily see this is going to be complex.
Mhm.
So what are we missing here? For example, one thing that we're missing is, and in terms of sustainability, is although there's some collaboration among groups, we need much more collaboration among
Mhm.
all of these groups that have the same agendas.
Mhm.
And we
Mhm.
need to use our power together collectively.
Mhm.
So when we could, let's say we can figure out the domains embedded in the question, and then we can say, well, we're not doing too poorly on this particular part, but here we're just totally missing the boat.
Right.
And that's one of the powerful things that you get out of this process.
Mhm. Yeah, and for me, a part of that question about sustainability, but the parts of it's actually an aspect of all the other complex questions I can think about is a question like, what are the costs? Or what are the implications and consequences? Or what are the negative implications and consequences that I'm not thinking of because I'm focused so much on the positive implications and consequences? For instance, about sustainability, I've read, I'm not vouching for it though, but I've read that what it does is it cuts down on the amount of agricultural produce in a major way. That might be fine, but it then has negative consequences for poorer people in various countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to just focus on the benefits of something. I also want to focus on possible negative consequences and then weigh one against the other.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes. Yes. And so again, I was looking at the categories that would come up under political. So we could see that
Right.
we would ask questions that had to do with equality across the world.
Right. Right.
So thank you, Gerald, for this
Yeah.
lively discussion.
Very pleasurable and intriguing and intellectually enlightening. Right.
So for all of you who have been with us, thank you. We'll see you at our next podcast, and we'll say goodbye.